On this video, we'll ask, as usual, various questions with regards to the coming Parsha, Parshat Vayikra. First, a few easy questions, and then some of the more complex ones. Here is a funny question: which of the Korbanot, actually Korban Mincha, an offering of wheat, which one is mentioned in our Shabbat Zmirot, in songs that we sing by the Shabbat table, and why? So it turns out there is a mincha al machbat, one type of mincha that's on a kind of pen, I guess. So this mincha is mentioned because it rhymes with Shabbat. Shomer Shabbat, mincha al machbat, that it will be as pleasant before Hashem as mincha on machbat. The Brisker Rav was once asked why it mentions this particular mincha, and he said because it rhymes with Shabbat. Here are a few more serious questions. Which kinds of animals could be brought as a korban? The answer is only three types of animals, and that is bull or cow, right? It's the same animal, male and female, or sheep, or goat. The three types of animals are all domestic kosher animals. You cannot bring korbanot from wild animals, and cannot, of course, bring korbanot from unclean, non-kosher animals. What about birds? With birds, it's more interesting because there are a lot of kosher birds out there, but only two are permitted for the korban. For whatever reason, the Torah only allows korbanot from two types of, I guess, pigeons. A turtle dove, one of them. It's pretty close. It's almost the same type of species, just that the Talmud mentions that one is a type of species that only a small, young bird would be brought, and the other the opposite. It's only the bird that's older that was brought. But it's two types of basically pigeons. Can the tzibur, the congregation, bring a korban of shlamim? The answer is yes, even though most shlamim. Shlamim, the word itself, it's not exactly clear what it means. There are a few different interpretations, whether it comes from the word shalom, peace, and that's how usually it's translated, peace offerings, or it comes from the word shalem, to compensate, to fulfill something. The simplest meaning seems to be that this is a kind of korban that includes everything. There is a piece that goes to Kohanim. Most of it is eaten by the person who brought it and his family and his friends, whoever else wants to participate and is invited to this festive meal. And also part goes, of course, on the altar. Right? You see, we use the word sacrifice, even though this word may associate with something barbaric and primitive, but what is it really? I mean, for example, let's say we have a Pesach Seder today. There's no korban, there's no temple today. But what exactly does it mean that we have to eat certain types of foods symbolically and in various ruchniot ways, in various spiritual ways, according to Kabbalah, fixing things in the spiritual worlds. But what is it? We eat specific kinds of foods, right? They're either symbolic or they do a tikkun, they rectify something in the world, whether it's matzah, whether it's maror. Let's say there would be also meat on Pesach Seder in remembrance of the Korban Pesach. Could such a thing happen? Actually, we follow the opinion that you're not allowed to today even eat roasted meat, any kind of roasted meat on Pesach Seder, so as not to mistaken it for a korban. You cannot bring korbanot outside the temple. But there was an opinion in Rome, there was a certain custom at some point that they used to actually eat roasted meat specifically on Pesach to make it in remembrance of the korbanot that were brought. So this is all today. But when the temple was standing, the only main difference was that the korban was actually brought and people ate that meat. But really it's just a symbolic meat. Most of the korban is eaten by the people themselves. So to call it korban, to call it a sacrifice in English might be incorrect word. You see, the word korban in Hebrew is not sacrifice. Korban is kind of from the word karov, to bring something close. It fixes things in the world, it brings us close to Hashem, whatever the meaning, the connotation of this word is, but it's not something you sacrifice. It's rather something that brings close. So what's the difference really if the custom would have been to eat meat symbolically remembering what happened when we came out of Egypt, or to have some of the fats and blood on the altar, so blood sprinkled on the altar and fats burned on the altar, as well as kidneys, and then the meat is eaten. And that's what the korban really is. So what I'm trying to say is that there is nothing more barbaric, chas v'shalom, in this than just eating meat symbolically, remembering Hashem's deliverance, how Hashem saved us, passed over our houses and didn't kill any of the Jews. But so if, for instance, something similar would have happened during, let's say, the Holocaust, instead of Jews being killed, instead Hashem would have executed all the Nazis and passed all the places where the Jews lived, and then commanded us to eat specific festive meal to remember this. That's all it is. It's not, I mean, of course there's deep things in it too, but what I'm trying to say is that there's nothing that far. I mean, there are of course extremists today from the left who would despise any eating meat, and they think it's a kind of achzariot, a kind of cruelty to animals, to eat animals altogether. But that's not the Jewish position. We have to try to, of course, when we slaughter animals, to do it the most humane way possible, which the kosher slaughter is. Traditionally, considering throughout history for thousands of years how everybody else slaughtered animals in all kinds of ways. Today there are people who claim that kosher slaughter is not humane enough from their point of view. But the point is that given that these laws were given and were practiced for thousands of years, when everybody else slaughtered in all kinds of ways and killed animals in all kinds of barbaric ways and making the animal suffer for long times, the kosher slaughter is made that it's quick. The animal almost within seconds basically doesn't feel anything. It's that the shrochtim are trained specifically to do it fast and to not push and to not use a knife that has a certain is not fully straight, has kinds of things that would draw the skin and would make the animal suffer. The way that the Jewish slaughter is, if it's done correctly, is one of the minimally offensive ways in terms of what the animal, and that's what a lot of scientists today also conclude. There are scientists today who conclude that kosher slaughter is generally not achzari at all, as some of the leftists, extreme leftists might want to say. But at any rate, the people who choose among non-Jews not to eat animals at all, that's their choice. We're not going to say whether they're wrong or right. This is their choice. They go as far as forbidding animals for everybody because they think it's a kind of achzarios. That's their choice. But in terms of us, we eat meat, and it's permitted, and sometimes a mitzvah. And in particular, when the temple was standing, there were certain cases when when the animals were brought as karbanot. That's all. It's not more achzari or more barbaric than just eating meat. So those who agree that at least people can eat meat, agree that people can bring a korban pesach, for instance, and eat the meat. Now, there are certain karbanot that are not eaten. And that's more complex, why such a thing was. In fact, that's the beginning of this week's parsha, Korban Olah. Why such a thing existed and for what reason they were brought. And I'm not going into this now. I discussed it many times in other places. But one thing for sure, that we believe that it was more than just symbolic, that it had something to do with fixing the oilamos, what's called the spiritual worlds. But there were sages among Jews, including Rambam, for instance, who thought that the karbanot were actually kind of compromise that Hashem allowed for the Jewish people, because that's the only way in the ancient world people served their deities. So Hashem said, okay, this is how you're going to serve me too, by bringing karbanot as one of them. It was never like it was a major cult of just karbanot. The Torah is very careful to make sure that we know that karbanot is just something that is a kind of tafel, a kind of secondary compared to everything else. That's why there are so many verses in Chazal, and that's why the Haftorahs that we read in this Parshiot, Vayikra, and the next one, Tzav, they all talk about how Hashem doesn't want just our karbanot. If people will just keep bringing karbanot and nothing else, and they think that, for instance, if they sin, they'll bring a korban and they'll be forgiven, that's not going to work. And that's why prophets Yeshayahu, Yirmiyahu, they all talked about it. That's not important. This was a secondary. And that's why probably it's Min Hashamayim that all this time we don't have the temple, since we cannot really bring Karbanot on the level that they should be brought correctly. And it can easily then descend into some kind of a just cultic behavior which doesn't bring anything worth with it. And when we will be on the level, so again we'll have Korban Pesach brought again, just like we now eat regular meat, there will be a Korban meat eaten. So at any rate, the general mitzvah of Shlamim, a little bit, I digressed a little bit, the mitzvah of Shlamim was the Korban that is brought by an individual. It was a kind of suda, a kind of meal, a festive meal with a meat in it, and it had to be eaten within a certain time period. But there was one time in a year, on the holiday of Shavuot, that the Korban of Shlamim was brought by the tzibur, by the congregation, only on Shavuot, 2 sheep of Shlamim. Can birds be brought as Shlamim or Asham? The answer is no. The birds are never brought as Shlamim or Asham. That's the type of Korbanot that are only animal Korbanot. Last question among the easier ones. There is one type of mincha that's mentioned in our parsha, that even though it says im, if you bring, but really Chazal explained that you have to bring that korban. What mincha is it? Mincha is, of course, the korbanot of flour or the various flour offerings and various bread offerings. The answer is it's minchat ha'omer, the one from which we count the day after Pesach. It was brought by barley mincha always the day after Pesach, and on it depended Shavuot. It is always 50 days later. 49 days we count, and on the 50th is Shavuot. So this Korban Omer is, according to Chazal, mentioned in our parsha, but it's not really mentioned as if it's a Korban that you have to bring. It says im, if you bring, but really it means when you bring in this case. And now I'm going to discuss 2 more complex questions. One is Yoteret HaKaved. There is something mentioned here. One of the parts of the animal that is burned on the altar is called Yoteret HaKaved. What part is it? So actually there is a dispute about it. It depends what the word Yoteret here means. Is Yoteret a kind of extra addition, meaning it's part of the liver? Kaved is of course liver. Is it part of the liver, a kind of lobe that sticks out, and it's usually in the animals that are brought as a korban, it rests on the right kidney? Or is it the diaphragm, which actually separates the liver together with the rest of the organs that are needed for digestion from the breathing part? Right? The diaphragm is actually needed for breathing. It makes the lungs filled with air, right, when it creates the vacuum in order for the lungs to expand. But even though the diaphragm has nothing to do with the liver physically, it's just next to the liver. But here it's called Yoteret HaKaved, possibly as a kind of Yoteret, meaning something spread over, something that's spread on top of Kaved. So that's the 2 disputes, whether it's part of liver, a little lobe that's sticking out of liver, or it's something that's spread over the liver. The next more complex question is, there is a special korban mentioned in our parsha that the whole eyes of congregation make a mistake, and the Jewish people do something wrong. What is it talking about, and how is this korban brought, and how many are brought, and what other similar korban is mentioned in Parshat Shelach? The answer is that if the Sanhedrin, they're called the eyes of the congregation, the leaders, if they make a mistake and they tell the Jewish people that something, for instance, that's normally forbidden, they think is permitted. For example, let's say in our day, if there would be Sanhedrin, and when electricity is invented, they start deciding, can you turn on the electric light on Shabbat? And they learned all the laws of how electricity works, and tried to understand how the bulb, right, after Edison invented the bulb, how that works. And they decided it's not considered like fire, it's permitted to turn on the light on Shabbat. And the majority of the people followed that opinion. And then, after some time passed, they decided to think over this, or they had other new arguments, and now they realized that it was a mistake. Really, electricity on Shabbat is just like any regular fire. It's forbidden from the Torah to turn on electric light on Shabbat. And that's how they decided by the new assembly. New Sanhedrin now decided that the previous psak, the previous decision was wrong. So that's when they would have to bring a special korban. Now there's a dispute exactly how this korban was brought. Was it once and for everybody, or was it for each tribe? There are many different opinions in Chazal. There's a whole tractate that deals mostly with these laws. It's called Harayot. And Rambam paskins that in such a case 12 bulls would be brought. So each tribe, Keneged each tribe, was one bull brought, because each of our 12 tribes was considered a separate kahal, separate congregation. So even if that particular tribe did not sin, maybe there nobody turned on the light on Shabbat, but still if the majority of the Jewish people followed that psak, for every tribe there would have to be brought a korban of bull. Now lastly, with regards to Parshat Shelach, there is a similar law mentioned there, that if the whole congregation breaks all of the Torah, and that Chazal Darshan, what does it mean all of the Torah? How is it practical that they break the entire Torah? So it means they worship idols. That's like breaking the entire Torah. So it's very similar, that law, except that instead of Shabbat is now an example, or some other law, maybe they would permit certain type of chametz, thinking that that's not the chametz that's forbidden from the Torah, or certain type of fats that they think is not forbidden from the Torah, chelef, right? As opposed to all these other laws, if they permit some kind of worship. They think that, okay, you're not allowed to worship idols, but you're allowed to, let's say, worship a man, because a man is holy and whatever, you're allowed to worship him. Or something like that. They would permit some kind of type of avodah zarah, type of idol worship, and then they would realize it was a mistake. So there's a different set of karbanot brought. Otherwise, the laws are very similar. It's just that for avodah zarah, for idol worship, there's a separate commandment in Parshat Shelach, after the Jewish people believed the 10 spies. In that parsha, there is this korban mentioned, what the Jewish people will do if they completely go astray and worship idols by mistake, based on Sanhedrin's wrong psak. That's the way Chazal understand this particular law. So all other laws are the same, except for the case of avodah zarah. There, the karbanot are different. And if you like this video, please press like.